Thank you, Madam Chair, and thank you for thanks for the testimony. I'll just say that this is an extraordinarily good year for both student leadership and faculty leadership. I think we're at the highest point in my time as president in terms of our ability to work together on positive ways to advance the university. So I'll highlight a couple of interesting things we've done and then update you on a little bit of business around us at the federal and state level. I do want to highlight two new academic programs. One is at Leeward Community College, and that's the Integrated Industrial Technology program that's starting up this month. And it's a 2-year Associate in Science degree with related certificates in careers such as manufacturing, electromechanical systems technicians. And this is also the program that is designed to help educate and train people who will work on the Honolulu area rapid transit, HART. So that's expected to employ about 120 individuals with the skills from this program. The second one is a program in ethnomathematics, and that one's a graduate certificate at the UH Manoa College of Education. And this is a new program. We've had substantial federal funding from both the National Science Foundation and the U.S. Department of Education, but it integrates indigenous wisdom and 21st century technology to bring math to students through real world applications in context. And this is one of the strategies that we're adopting. This is a teacher education program to help teachers work with students who generally may not react well, many of whom may not react well to traditional math taught in a traditional lecture format in the classroom, but making it real in context. And a lot of it is tied into sustainability. And this one is led by one of our really up-and-coming faculty members who just made full professor, Linda Ferrudo, who is also an apprentice navigator on the Hokulea and is currently on sabbatical this year at Stanford and Columbia University. So that's the quality of faculty we have, creating the first such program in the country. In a related area, this is all of our campuses are very active. Last month, it was announced that Hawaii will be hosting SACNAS, which is, I'm not even going to tell you what it stands for, but it's basically the Diversity in STEM Conference. Several thousand people from around the world will be coming to Hawaii. And again, this is a group of UH faculty that have worked together across the system who have participated in the conference. And when we bring conferences here, I often like to highlight that we are lauded every single year by the visitor industry for the work of our faculty across the system. We not only bring several thousand people here, we also get to highlight the great work that our faculty and students are doing across the state, but we also, many more people from our university can participate because we don't have to pay travel costs associated with going to the mainland or even another country for an international conference like this. I'll just highlight one very prominent gift/grant. So Margaret McFall-Ngai, many of you have met. She's one of our leading researchers at UH Manoa. So she was just recognized last month by the Howard Hughes Medical Institute. So this is arguably one of the most significant grants one can get. There are only 14 awardees this year, and her fellow awardees are from Cornell, UCLA, UT Austin, Berkeley, Yale, Stanford, Vanderbilt, Stanford, UC Santa Cruz, UT Austin, UC Santa Cruz. So these are pretty good schools. They're in the life sciences. It's about $1 million, so it's not a huge amount of money. But this is a program to completely rework our biology curriculum. And this is an area where at UH Manoa we're doing a lot of work to bring together people who haven't worked together as well as they should. She's actually a research faculty member in one of our organized research units, but she will be working with our instructional biology faculty. So this is what we talk about, the work that's going on, and I think our new buzzword for this is to reintegrate education and research at UH Manoa for the benefit of both. And this is also an example of the work we're doing with the UH Foundation. When we get the research reports from Vasilis each quarter or so, he is reporting purely on extramural funds that are processed through our Office of Research Services. This is an example. It is processed as a gift because it comes from another nonprofit rather than from a government agency or a corporation. But it is actually, more like a research project than a gift in the traditional sense. So we need to look at how we report these things. I think the group at the UH Foundation that helps us with these is quite strong, and I think we will be looking more to private foundations to support our research enterprise as things become more difficult with the federal government. Speaking of the federal government, it seems a lifetime ago that the federal government passed a tax bill, remember that? There was a huge amount of angst in higher education over some of the consequences. I will say the final bill that passed was not as bad as some of the bills that were passed by the House and Senate both, but I do want to highlight a couple of things. So the best news is that the provision in the House bill to make tuition waivers to graduate students taxable, that was not included in the final bill. That was probably the most detrimental thing in there. Similarly, the provision to make tuition waivers for our faculty and staff, which is included in collective bargaining, that also was not included. And there were a couple of provisions in both the House and Senate bills that would have hurt some of the tax credits for higher education. Those were also not included. So that's pretty much the end of the good news. What was included, and this was on the front page of the paper one day, was the elimination of the deduction for 80% of the premium sports seats packages. So a large portion of when people buy premium seats has been considered a donation, and so that was eliminated. There was also some loss in flexibility on how we handle UBIT, unrelated business income tax. We can no longer look at ourselves as an enterprise. Each activity within the institution has to be assessed individually. So if we lose money at something, that doesn't help us with another area where we might make money. Two things that don't impact us now, which tells you a little bit about where we are. One is they did pass a tax on endowments at institutions which have a very large endowment per student. So that's how they looked at it. I am sorry to report that our endowment is nowhere near the level at which we will be taxed. Perhaps one day we can look forward to that. Another one is there is a 21% tax or surcharge on salaries above $1 million. We have none of those either. End of comment. Most of the impact, and perhaps most worrisome besides the athletics provision for us, is probably the raising of the standard deduction. And it is unclear at this point the extent to which charitable giving, it's a grave concern in the philanthropic community. I think there's an expectation that there are people who may not donate because they no longer itemize their deductions because the standard deduction is higher. We won't know the extent of that until things play out. We would like to believe that people are giving because they believe in what we do, and I'm hopeful that that will continue. There is also concern nationally that the elimination of the tax exemption for state and local taxes, income tax and property tax, that will also shift the both the influence on itemizing deductions, which I just mentioned, but also there's a concern that some states may relook at their tax structures and that could result in disinvestment in what are considered discretionary programs like public higher education. So we have not yet received any rumblings like that out of our state, but it's something to keep an eye on. The issue of state investment in public higher education, though, this did come up, and I mentioned this to the Budget and Finance Committee, but I'll just be brief and once again lauding Vice President Young and his team, who at a time when many people were preparing for the holidays, and unfortunately many of us were preparing for a set of surprise informational briefings the week between Christmas and New Year's, his team did close a bond sale in New York December 28th that will result in savings of about $17 million over 20 years. This turns into a real savings in operating budgets, and I'll just mention the programs that are most positively impacted. One is the Manoa RTRF Fund, which supports the revenue bonds associated with the Daniel K. Inouye Center for Microbial Oceanography Research and Education. We financed part of that construction with revenue bonds supported by RTRF. The West Oahu campus development, a portion of which was supported with revenue bonds. That's a savings of $3.58 million over 20 years. So you get a sense, this is real money to real programs that will certainly help us. And I will also note that both rating agencies are really not very positive about higher education as a sector, yet the University of Hawaii bonds were reaffirmed by both Fitch and Moody's just as part of this transaction in December. We were rated as stable, which is great news for us. A word about emergency preparation. I'm sure all of you have been talking about where you were that fateful Saturday morning. I will tell you that for me, I did not get the emergency message from the state for whatever reason on my cell phone. I was sitting at my computer working, and I had public radio on, and I did not get the warning from public radio. So the first thing I got was actually one of the H alerts from one of our campuses. And my first fear was that we had been hacked and somebody sent out a fraudulent alert. So I was one of the few people who was relieved that there actually was a state alert, and it wasn't us. I think like every organization everywhere in the state, and frankly I think across the country, this is a real learning opportunity for us. And I think we have several lessons, and I thank Dan Meisenthal convened a group of emergency communicators and managers from across the system. Probably the two most important lessons for us to learn how to do differently. One is we had told students in the fall that if this happens, and many of you know we were ridiculed across the country for sending out instructions on what to do in the event of a missile attack. But those instructions were actually quite accurate to shelter in place and wait for word, basically. And we had students running around looking for shelters. So clearly we had not communicated as effectively as we need to. So that process of reinforcing the messages, including telling people who are on our campuses where to shelter in the building or in an adjacent building, which we do for fire drills. We need to do something similar. So that's going to be a fair amount of work for us, and we also need to improve that communication. And then we also have to fine-tune the way we handle our emergency alerts, which go out by text messages and emails. For example, in this case, probably we didn't need all of our campuses independently sending out messages about what is a statewide matter. So I think we did okay, but it's definitely an opportunity for us to fine-tune our processes. And I think most of you get the messages I send out to the entire university community about these things. Let me say a word about bills that were introduced. So yesterday, we couldn't give this to you days in advance, but we can send you something after the fact. But yesterday, close of business was the deadline for bill introduction, and certainly interesting bills were being introduced through yesterday. So even the listing I got on Tuesday was no longer appropriate for this update. First, I want to say all of our bills, and I think we've briefed you on those, none of which are earth-shattering, but all of them have been introduced either as part of the administration package or by legislators who received them from us. Several bills relating directly to the Board of Regents, several bills about the appointment process, including impacting the Regents Candidate Advisory Council. I guess what I'd say is perhaps the most alarming bill is, it's actually two bills, but a direct set of bills to revoke the autonomy that was provided to the university through the 2000 constitutional amendment and associated legislation. We will obviously be working very hard to kill that, but just so you get a sense of some of what's going on in the big square building. Several bills relating to astronomy in Mauna Kea, one of which would transfer the Institute for Astronomy from UH Manoa to UH Hilo, one of which requires the state auditor to conduct a forensic audit of all of the activities relating to Mauna Kea, and one of which establishes the Mauna Kea Management Authority as an alternative to University of Hawaii management. That was introduced late yesterday. So that gives you a feel for some of the thinking by at least one legislator in each of those areas. A number of bills relating to the Hawaii Promise program, so those tend to be a lot of work. We appreciate the support for the program, as always. Each of them has a different wrinkle to them, so we'll need to work through to get to an end game in which hopefully we receive additional resources to fully fund the program at the community colleges. And even yesterday, I think Calvert and Stephanie Kim and I visited 9 or 10 legislators yesterday. A lot of interest in extending the program to the four-year universities once again. There's a bill that would prohibit the University of Hawaii Board of Regents from charging residents community college tuition at all. And there is a bill that caps increases in tuition based on changes in the state's median household income. So a fair number of activities around that. And then finally, let me mention that there are bills, once again, to establish collective bargaining unit for University of Hawaii graduate student assistants. So that, in fact, is being heard today for the first time. So we'll have be testifying again in opposition as we have before, noting that we did request in the Board of Regents budget funding to increase salaries for our graduate assistants as well. Finally, let me just briefly mention the item that was on the front page of the paper this morning about a data breach. I am going to be quite circumspect in how I talk about this because we are in active conversation with federal agencies that have asked us not to say very much. The event actually occurred last fall. We did a private notification to the potentially impacted individuals, and we were prepared for media last fall, media interest, which never came for some reason. What happened last week is that a reporter noticed the report we had filed with the legislature, which is a mandatory report, and just decided to write a story months after the actual event, which then became front page news today, go figure. But in brief, while we were investigating an email compromise, it was noticed that network devices on a particular network within a unit on a campus had been compromised, and that those devices contain, or may have been compromised, and one of those devices contained sensitive information. So we do not know whether any sensitive information was accessed, was copied. We have no evidence to date that any of it was utilized in any nefarious fashion, and our best guess based on the situation, which I can't say much about, is that this was not an attempt to access sensitive information at all. There was some other context for the breach that was going on. I think the fact that I keep telling you that federal law enforcement agencies are involved is probably a little bit of a hint, but I'll let you speculate about that. It was about 24 individuals for whom personal information was on one of the devices that may have been compromised. So we did notify all of them directly, and we offered them advice on what to do and a year of data breach insurance, essentially. I guess most of you were impacted by the credit bureau breach and or the OPM breach, so at some point you run out of how many of these insurance policies you want. But in the event anybody doesn't already have such protection, they now have an opportunity to get that from us at no cost. And we're also assessing what we can do to improve security. We do have a very strong security team. I think the federal government is very appreciative of our efforts. And this particular attack is extremely sophisticated. I'll leave it at that. It's not, it wasn't something like not applying the software update that had been released much earlier.